Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise the Fire podcast. I hope you like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and support me on Subscribestar Locals and Buy Me a Coffee. I'm once again joined by Flurian. Glad to have you back.
Glad to be here.
So, about a week ago, I was thinking to myself, I haven't really been hearing anything about climate change. Now, I mean, if you're like consuming left-wing coded media, I hear you'll still hear about that. But I remember, like even just 10 years ago, no matter what kind of media you were consuming, you were going to hear climate change either being inserted into it or as a response, right? And there's not much at all. And a lot of the usual suspects, like for example, Al Gore hasn't been saying much about that for a long time. And I thought to myself, okay, well, what actually was going on? Because obviously, what they said they wanted in this sort of like exalted sense didn't happen. And then I'm beginning to think maybe they never wanted that, but they didn't spend money for no reason. Like what were they spending this money on? What was the point? So I thought, well, okay, a thing is what a thing does. Let's look at this thing as if it was a psychological warfare operation. Well, I thought I saw 6 things that came to mind, and we can go into them in detail as we continue the episode. One is it suppressed third world development because, right, China and India were burning a lot of coal in order to industrialize, and any sort of regulations on like Copenhagen, I think that was during Obama's administration, would have put pressures on them that would have hampered their industrialization. Then there was the running cover for free trade, the gutting of the U.S. industry. It's like, well, don't be sad. This is good for the planet. We don't have factories anymore. Pushing depopulation narratives. Having more than 2 kids is bad, and maybe you shouldn't even have 2 kids at all. Discredit sensible environmental policies with junk science. Think of like that leak from the UK research lab where they openly admitted to fabricating a lot of the data. Create fear through megalophobia. It's too big for any one person to solve. And then push for a one world government, which of course they didn't actually get that, but that was a part of their project. So they got 5 out of 6. And as a sort of like just entry point, what do you think about this framing of the climate change discussion for you?
Yeah, I just I when I was in high school, there was one public science guy in Germany, like a little bit like Bill Nye the Science Guy, but much more, much wiser and much reputable guy, Heumer von Ditfurth, and he was talking about he was basically having a Malthusian view, right? He was warning that population is too big. Population grows exponentially and food supply will only grow linearly. And I think that view has been debunked. He was very adamant about that. And when I asked ChatGPT, like if AI can give me a quick overview what of his initial thesis and what of these theses have been panned out to be true, ChatGPT gave me 10 theses, and 8 of them, according to ChatGPT, were still coming true, and I couldn't really believe that. And I think it hasn't been true because we have much better ways of cultivating food, and many other of his alarmism that he sometimes used didn't come through. And but that tells me the way that ChatGPT and AI works. They're a little bit like a keyword engine, but instead of like Google, who gives you results based on keywords, AI LLMs will give you results based on data structure, on context, and it tells me that there's still a large narrative of the powers that be, if you will, that still say, yeah, but if you really look, that's all. This climate change is still dangerous. So that if you confront climate change people and meteorologists with their predictions not panning out, they will still say, well, actually, it's still true because you can see the temperature here really increased a little bit, and for that reason, you need to look at data. And I looked at some data. For example, let me find it on my Word files. Yeah, for example, um, one thing is that one wild climb of climate change proponents, and it's important to distinguish between people that say climate change cannot happen, and people that say human-made climate change, right? So those two different things, right? Climate change. So if you call people that criticize all the climate change claims, they are often smeared as climate change denier. But no, I mean, climate always changes. It's just that, that we don't think that people have caused it. And if you look at it, for example, one claim is wildland fires, right? The claim is that wildfires have increased because of global warming. But if you look at the number of acres burned in the U.S. And start in around 1920, you find that the number of acres burned is much higher back then, and then it went down to like a very, very low percentage, like maybe 10% of the initial peak at the 1930s. And by 1970s, there's no wildfire problem, and it has a little bit increased towards 2020, but not significantly, right? And what what we see instead from these wildfires are, oh, climate change, we need to do something. And then you look at Hawaii when and Malibu, that two areas that have been completely devastated by wildfires recently. And in Hawaii, there was a woo-woo tribal water guy who held the water for distinguishing the fires back because of indigenous concerns that we can't share the water or whatnot. So that was basically bureaucratic incompetence. And then in the Malibu area, a lot of these properties that are basically burned down, they're now bought up by the Chinese for pennies on the dollars, basically, right? So maybe, and I don't believe people said, oh, those wildfires, they were space lasers. Maybe not, but they were kind of like, let's say Governor Newsom used the kind of like a hands-off approach to the wildfires, and then the wildfires, once they were done going through Malibu and other areas, then all of a sudden people couldn't return into their houses, and now they are bought by the Chinese and some other economic elites for cheap, right? So maybe that was the purpose of the climate alarmism all along, right? So another point is another alarmism of climate change, of global warming, is that the global average sea levels, they change, right? Yeah, they do. But if you look at data from 1880, as end of the 19th century until now, you can see that the sea levels, they change relative to 1880. Have always done so, but they haven't done faster lately. That's not true. If any, the sea level change has declined a little bit. It's increasing more slowly. So yeah, sea level is changing, but that has always been there, right? So that's one problem that gets over exaggerated. And then my absolute favorite is the Vostok ice cores. If you type in Vostok ice core, VOSTOK, they measure these ice cores, and then they can look much like you can fell a tree, and then you can look at the rings inside the tree, how old the tree is, and if the rings are a little bit more fuzzy, then maybe there was some scarcity in resources during that years, and so on. And so you can also take ice cores out, and then you can see the CO2 that had been accumulated, methane, and even the temperature that has been the case in like going back 400 of thousands of years. And if you look at those ice cores, then you see that there's always been fluctuations. Like every 50,000, 60,000 years, temperature goes up, temperature goes down, temperature goes up, temperature goes down. And if you look at the current temperature increase, it is not different from the past temperature going up. So yeah, there's temperature increase, but that same temperature increase has been there in the past as well. And it was past, I mean, 400,000 years ago, when humans didn't even exist, there was the same level of climate change or temperature change. So after I saw that, that was actually my point that red pilled me on the whole thing, like 10 years ago. I think Aaron Clary pointed that out. Look at the Vostok ice cores. I looked at them and said, yeah, man, this is all bullshit. Why do we have to be worried about climate change and temperature rising when it has been risen the same 400,000 years ago and 800,000 years ago and 1,200,000 years ago, right? So since we can't say whether the temperature increase is due to human activity or not, we can probably safely discard all the alarmism, right? And also, and that's something you said, Todd. All the climate alarmism, it basically obscure the sensible measures. Like, sure, maybe that is a problem that the temperature is changing, but let's get off the hysteria that humans need to repent for some evil they did to the planet, and just maybe think about ways that we can curb temperature change. Or maybe it is not a problem, but anything that you want, any more rational approach to the problem is basically completely stomped over based on the whole climate change hysteria. And so there are ulterior motives in play, and several of them you have noted. I've contributed to those by mentioning the Maui and Malibu fires. And yeah, it's basically you create fear via megalophobia, and you kind of push for one world document. You discredit sensitive policies. Yeah, and what is behind it all is often like a depopulation agenda. Like the entire climate change industry was probably started somewhere in the 1960s. Lyndon B. Johnson had a commission, like, or a science advisory committee, and they put out a report that noted CO2 could cause measurable and perhaps marked climate change impact by the year 2000, right? And then there was a United Nations conference on the human environment in Stockholm, and then they all boosted the discussion about global warming and climate change, and then there was a climate conference in Geneva, where scientists formally warned that continued CO2 increases could lead to significant warming. And why would they look at CO2? Well, methane they could also look at, but no, they looked at CO2 mainly. Why? And basically, water is also a climate, also temperature enhancer, but they look at CO2, and it's true, it leads to de-industrialization because CO2 is the number one output product of power plants and industrial steel mills and all that kind of stuff, right? It all produces CO2, and so you get to wonder whether that was really the agenda, like pushing for.
You cut out, Flurian. You cut out again. Hello?
Yep.
Okay, you're back. Go ahead and finish your point.
What didn't you hear?
You cut out for a moment. I didn't hear your last word.
Oh, okay. Yeah, basically, I'm saying that I find it curious that everything was that basically the public narrative was centered on CO2, right? And that is a product that industries emit, right? So you need to put like these big how would you call them? Like some ways of reducing CO2 and all the kind of stuff. Of course, it's hampering your industrial development, and there's also a big part of romanticizing of indigenous and underdeveloped areas, like, oh, those poor people in India, those poor people in Asia, they suffer about all the plastic that we produce, and so we implement paper straws in our fast food. And then you see pictures from India where people just dump their plastic trash somewhere on the street, right? Developing countries are actually one of the biggest sinners, if you want to see that as a sin, of destroying the environment. They just throw things into they throw things away, and they all, like, I saw like an Indian woman say once, of course she throws things onto the street because she pays taxes, so the government has to clean it up. And I think that's not the notion you have in the West. The West is about being stewards of the environment, right? It's not a transactional way. I can trash my environment and then the government will come clean it up, and I pay them to clean it up. So that's actually the other way around. But the Green Party guys and girls, they have some kind of like romanticizing of the indigenous tribes in their narrative, right? And so that also plays a role. I would call them useful idiots of a more elite-based depopulation agenda.
Yeah. So if we look at the points that we have, the first one is, how does the proposed environmental regulations of 10 to 15 years ago affect developing countries? Well, first of all, you have to burn coal first to industrialize. So if you mandate things like solar, wind, or renewables, they don't have the infrastructure yet to build those things. The Europe and America do. East Asia does, right? So you're putting a obstacle to their economic development, and they're going to be like, well, Europe and America put all that CO2 in the air, and now they have the quote means to produce these other forms of energy that are not as carbon emitting, right? So in that sense, you are putting a hurdle in front, and that's why China and India didn't really go along with Copenhagen. They're like, we're not doing this. So that's now it's did it. I mean, that's what it's supposed to do. And the other reason why I before I go further, the other reason why I went this way is, according to Al Gore, a lot of this like seaside real estate property was going to be flooded within his lifetime. He owned that property. You're not going to own that property if it's flooded. Like, I don't care, money talks and shit walks, right? It's just stupid. We know that they didn't believe that. Okay. Now, the other thing is, if we look at the cover for free trade, now this does two things. Okay. One is America is being deindustrialized in the Rust Belt. Okay. And these people are losing their jobs because the factories are going overseas. And that's creating a, post-industrial service sector economy. And the left used to be the center of the American working class and socialism and labor movement and all that. Environmentalism within my lifetime has been left-wing coded, right? So what it does is it targets left-wing people to not protect or defend working class interests, because it gets them to think, oh, that's actually good. These industries are bad, so we're just going to let them go overseas. Second of all, it creates an acceptance of austerity. You ought to accept austerity because it's good for the planet. And of course, with 2007 and 8, with Bush and Obama, talk about austerity was very unpopular. So if you could couch austerity in terms of consuming less for the planet, well, you could defang and take the oxygen out of the room for a lot of people on the left, right? Mm-hmm. And then this also ties into depopulation narratives. Having children is bad because people consume carbon. Now, how do we know the depopulation narrative is BS? Because of the immigration policy of the U.S. Do you think a Nigerian immigrant will consume more carbon in Nigeria or in the United States? Oh, the United States, right. That's where they're going to consume more carbon. So why are you flooding the country with people if they're going to consume more carbon because they're living in the United States? They ipso facto would consume less carbon in a country that is underdeveloped. Okay, we know that this was an insincere, phony, absurd objection. Now, this fits into the broader New World Order paradigm of global population reduction, which I remember about 1992, 93 in Nature magazine, Ted Turner said he would like to see the world population reduced by 90 to 95%. And I was like, okay, he said it right there. And so the logic just doesn't make sense. If you want to reduce people's carbon emissions, you'd have a zero immigration policy, because guess what you're going to do if you bring in immigrants? You're going to raise the carbon footprint of the United States. But if you have a zero immigration policy, you don't increase the carbon emission. So this is just completely dishonest, right? It's completely phony. It's completely fraudulent. Now, with like sensible environmental policies that were discredited. So what was it? No, it was some UK university. I was in college when this happened. It might have been like 2008 or 9. And there was a hacker, some people thought it might be Russian, who exposed this climate research group, and they were just admitting to fabricating the data. And so that was sort of another, big wake-up call. But so, for example, by creating this impression that we have to have we have this human, like you said, human sin of anthropogenic global warming. The idea is it gets in the way of dealing with issues on a case-by-case basis, right? So let's say you have pollution in a river or somewhere, right? You could just deal it at that level under the principles of subsidiarity. But the problem is the rhetoric would eventually say, well, what is that going to matter if the whole planet cooks? So unless we solve this big problem that nobody can solve, apparently, uh, that's going to take oxygen out of the room for other kinds of discussions about conservation and ecology, because it just kicks it up to this level that can't be dealt with. If we look at the megalophobia, well, it's no one person can solve that problem. It's too big. It's the whole world, right? And of course that scares people. People are like, well, I can't do this. I can't do that. And it sort of locks them in place. Now they might do token things like, cleaning up litter and recycling. I'm not saying that's bad, but that's not going to solve the megalophobic problem that has been generated. And then lastly, one world government. And this was always the goal, because if you create a problem that could only be solved at the level of a global government, and then you were the ones that led that global government, what do you know, right? There was one of Obama's science czars, a man named John P. Holdren, co-authored a book called Eco Science in 1977, saying that he would like to see a one world government regulating trade and population and ensuring that families didn't have more than 2 children.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, this is complete takeover mentality here, right? And so all of these things were a part of the objective of the environmental narrative that we received from these scientific think tanks, from the government, from the media, from Ted Turner, right? All of these things. Also, too, you could make a lot of money, right? People made money in the green industry, right? That was created to look like you were doing something while America was being deindustrialized. And so that made a lot of money, right? Also, too, if you advocate or mandate people not have children, that means you have a built-in market for contraception, because that's the only way to ensure that you get that. That's going to be very profitable for whoever is running that operation. Florian.
Yeah. I also realized something that didn't get much coverage in the U.S., I think, but was a big thing in Germany for a while, and in other countries in Europe. They were climate activists who would glue themselves onto the street. Like, imagine a busy intersection, and they just show up, and then they just sit down, and basically no traffic can roll there anymore, right? They don't care often when someone has a medical emergency or needs to go to a hospital. They don't care, and that led in some cases to angry drivers to rip them to the side of the road and or beat them up, which was cheered on by others, I would say, understandably. But these people had money to withstand. First of all, they were paid activists. They also had money to withstand the lawsuits they were involved in then. And another fraction of those guys would go to museums, and then throw buttermilk on a Van Gogh painting, and dealing serious damage to those paintings. Why? What that has to do with climate change, I don't understand. It doesn't have anything to do. They just wanted to create some public, they wanted to make a public statement, right? Now we can't be forgotten. We destroyed this painting. Yeah, if you destroy the Mona Lisa, people will be aware of you. They will hate you, but you get publicity, and somebody has to pay has to pay for that, because in most cases the paintings can be restored, thankfully, but it's costly, right? And those are basically several organizations that support these people. There's a climate emergency fund, things like that. Some traditional left-wing groups, some associations, stipends for activists, and some billionaires. I forgot her name, but there was a U.S.-based or UK-based billionaire who donated $500,000 or more to the cause. And then you can even expand that, the whole network. You also have the Greta Thunberg people there, and they're also paid, right? So it's a PsyOp, and they want to push some degrowth agenda or some agenda. It's clearly financed by elites, and they have the little foot soldiers that carry out those spontaneous street protests. But it also has a darker undertone, because if you take people's paintings away, right? That's you're doing the same that the Taliban did with statues, or ISIS with some of the statues that they conquered, right? It's a sign you conquered the culture, and so you destroy their symbols, and that also plays a role there. In which case, for that will change. That will show you already that it's not about the environment; it's about societal change. That's what these people want, and I think. And that's all financed by millionaires and billionaire networks.
Yeah, there was an interesting documentary that came out in 2019 called Planet of the Humans. It's produced by Jeff Gibbs, but it was assistant director was Michael Moore, and it was criticizing this idea of the corporate controlled environmental movement, where one segment of the movie they're basically talking about cutting down trees and burning them for fuel as green, as a replacement for coal. And the documentary is like, but this is feeding deforestation. How is this part of a broader green agenda? And of course it's not. And so what ends up happening is the takeaway from the film is that the modern green movement that is run by these billionaires and tech oligarchs is just one more way to wring energy and resources out of natural resources, not because it's actually concerned about some sort of survival of the planet. And the other problem too with the broader environmental movement, which is why very few people were actually serious. Most liberals during the Obama years thought that you could maintain current levels of energy consumption with green energy, which is just not possible. The EROI on green energy is not good. Not that the EROI on oil is much better, but I've already talked about collapse enough. So I'll just say that there was a lot of misunderstanding as to what that would actually entail or mean. And the other thing with the depopulation narrative is they assumed that all human energy consumption was equal, right? So before the Industrial Revolution, we had population growth, but it didn't, quote unquote, cause greenhouse emissions. And that's because we didn't have industrial levels of consumption. And the other problem is why do we have a consumer-oriented society like the way we do? Well, one of the problems, and old school leftists would talk about this, but the environmental movement really didn't, was that a lot of this consumption is artificially stimulated. There's the problem of overproduction. And, you've got the book American Prosperity by Paul Maslow, published in the early 1920s, saying that the solution to overproduction, and by overproduction, I mean the problem of, other than like food and soap and, cleaning materials, which you use on a regular basis and consume, clothes, furniture, housing, that stuff is just going to last. And then if it lasts, then you'll saturate the market, and then you got to shut down your factory, which means you don't make money. So they created, artificial demand. And that's really the problem. Now you could say, is that an inevitable problem of industrial civilization? Maybe. I mean, because the Soviet Union, even though it wasn't a capitalist economy, had 5-year plans and all of these, growth-directed programs that had nothing to do with the problem of overproduction. For example, Keith Woods did a video a few years back about Soviet whaling and how they just kept on giving these 5-year plans for like killing whales to turn their blubber into pharmaceuticals and stuff. So it's like there's maybe, but the point is though, you could in theory just have laws against that and say, you can't use these measures to stimulate demand and work out some other way of producing. But they didn't really talk about that either. And they tended to fall into sensationalism, like, oh, just shut off all the factories now. I mean, okay, that's not going to end well for a lot of people. Nobody's going to implement that as a strategy. So it's almost like it was calculated to propose strategies that nobody was ever going to accept, which means it just wasn't going to work, right? And that I think is what really struck me about the environmental movement is these were people that really weren't looking for strategies to solve the problem. They were making demands that were quote unquote impossible to implement, or either politically impossible or actually physically impossible. And it kind of created this stalemate. And I guess you could say a seventh thing that was done was these people contributed to the culture war conflict, right? They're making demands that are either politically impossible or physically impossible to implement, which has the net effect of just angering one half of the country and feeding into this broader loop of culture war tensions, right? So that would then keep the people facing each other horizontally rather than going vertically up to target the people that are really in charge. So, that's another thing too.
Yeah, but these people are really serious. Some of them. I mean, some of them, meaning, for example, the entire German government, um, which is actually interesting. The Green Party came of age in the. It started in the 70s in Germany, and it was driven by environmentalism. Right? It was basically and if you ask who brought who, I mean, you can ask who put all the environmentalism law and the animal welfare laws on the books in Germany. Who did that? Well, a certain Austrian uncle from 1933 to 1945. Environmental laws and animal welfare is something that yeah that the Nazis implemented, and the Allied after 1945 kept those laws because those were laws that were good, and so you had a lot of the people that were actually in favor of environmentalism. It was a very conservative issue. It developed as one, and then you had people forming a party, and it was all about, in the 1970s, it was called the Green Alternative List in some areas in Germany, and they were about keeping your environment clean and nice. And then you had an influx of left wingers into the Green Party. There were Maoists in there, and that blew over. But basically, then the Green Party lingered around in the 1980s. Then Chernobyl happened, and then Green Party politicians were started to be elected, and um, they were they were then always trying to get rid of nuclear power. That was one other big thing of them. Nuclear power, we have to get rid of it. And they never quite succeeded. But then you had Fukushima in 2011, I think, and all of a sudden Angela Merkel, supposedly a conservative politician, put an agenda in that would basically shut up German nuclear power plants and by 2020, and they were successful in that. The German conservatives did that. Now, you need to know that the German Conservative Party is called itself Christian Democratic Union, and they have a little bit Burkean conservatism in there, but they have a lot of ordo-liberalism in there, and basically Catholic social teaching. That's basically uh, their set, you know. And so these are not real conservatives; they are pretty liberal. And but it's astonishing that Angela Merkel just was the one who got rid of all the nuclear power plants. And now Germany has a problem because now they have to import their energy. They're not energy independent anymore, and the Germans still think that's great. Like they have to make do with some heat pump to power their houses, and that causes its own problems in terms of energy costs and everything. And also, someone on X recently, or like a couple of years ago, remarked that Germany got all the exemptions for its energy-intensive industries like chemicals, metals, paper, but they still had to pay for Euro initiatives to fund renewable powers, which left ordinary household consumers to pick up the bill, right? And maybe that's also another step that politicians like, if households cannot sustain independently for long enough, right? That's actually, I don't think that's something politicians want, but there's certainly politicians like households and voters that are more dependent on them than less dependent. And that's one of the outcomes from the little de-industrialization, you know, branch that Germany went on. And you still have people in the Green Party that aggressively push a degrowth agenda. So I'm sometimes wondering, since I'm not living in Germany anymore, I don't know how many people are really carrying that kind of policy, but it's still alive and well in Germany, right? They should actually kick out the politicians that got rid of all the nuclear power plants, but they are somehow that's fine. And so that's another thing that elites can always rely on, the passivity and inertia of the population.
Yeah, and to circle this back around to the fact that what their stated goal was, well, some of it was true. They did say they wanted a one world government, but ultimately they didn't believe in the narrative, and they didn't push policies that were going to make. If you believe carbon emissions are the problem, they weren't pushing policies that were going to deal with that. So, for example, again, these billionaires, these oligarchs, these politicians owned property that was going to be flooded on the timeline that Al Gore stated. They didn't sell that property. You'd expect them to sell it. Okay, so they didn't actually believe it. And second of all, again, I have to go back to immigration here, right? If you are worried about people consuming carbon, the last thing you do is you bring them into this country, because the United States, according to all the environmental stuff, was, hey, the U.S. consumes the most, right? So why are you bringing them here? That's just completely 100% at odds with what you just said. Second of all, if you go back to the Cold War era, the world's greatest producer was the Soviet Union. We know this. They were the world's greatest polluter. Rand did a report in 1991 on Russia, the former Soviet republics, and Eastern Europe. And something like 50% of the air and soil was polluted. That's insane. Nothing like that occurred in the United States. In fact, there's places in Russia still where you get black snow from the soot from factories. Where was the environmental movement on that? Mum's the word. Mum's the word. Nothing about the Soviet pollution. And whales. Again, I am in favor of international regulation on whaling, but they were totally silent on the Soviet Union, which was the world's largest poacher of whales, far beyond Japan and Iceland, who came in second and third. Again, nothing. Well, that's interesting. Why would you be silent about the world's largest illegal poacher of whales? Yeah, I know, right? And then also later China's industrialization, right? In the early 2000s, there's large parts of rural China that are very polluted due to the industry. So, for example, one of the things that Mao did, so forget about the industrialization of China, the border between Russia and Mongolia and China, that band of desert and steppe, there were forests there that were cut down to produce the Mao's Little Red Book. And that created a lot of loose soil that was blown around. And that soil was also polluted and contaminated due to China's lack of environmental regulation. So you have toxic soil that's blown towards the Pacific because those areas were uprooted because the roots of the trees and other plants were holding that soil in place. But they were cut down in these, bizarre Maoist initiatives. And then Mao had the war against the sparrow, which helped contribute to the Great Famine. So all of these atrocious, hellacious industrial disasters under communism were completely ignored by environmentalists. And it's like, look, I'm not saying that would excuse the Exxon Valdez or other industrial disasters in the Western world, but there's no comparison due to the just malicious destruction of the environment by these communist countries. And the environmental movement was totally silent on this. And I'm like, I can't take you seriously if you're going to be silent on the Soviet Union, who is the world's largest illegal poacher of whales. And then you're going to cry to me about the humpback whale. Well, why don't you point the finger at somebody? Why don't you point the finger at the Soviet Union, advocate international sanctions against them? That never happened at all. And then nobody protested Mao deforesting northern China. in order to produce a little red book. And I'm like, okay, do these people even really believe in environmental factors? I mean, up to a point, maybe, but this is a real problem that they don't address. And then the other big problem with climate change that they don't address, or environmental issues, is if you look at a map, because when I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, I was really big into like the children's edutainment that was pitched at like nature, animals, stuff like that. And zoo books, for example, right, was a big one. And you look at all of these timelines for poaching of ivory, rhinos, and elephants. All peaks in the 80s and 90s. And most populations are in South Africa and Rhodesia. Well, what happened in the 80s and 90s? You went from white minority rule to black majority rule. And of course, black majority rule was a complete catastrophe for ecology, and rhinos and elephants were open season. So, for example, Rhodesia from 1965 to 1980, in any given year, only maybe like a handful of rhinos or elephants were poached, like, 6. And then it just explodes under Mugabe. Nothing. They act like it's, see, the environmentalists acted like it was a problem for white Americans when it was black majority rule Zimbabwe that presided over this. For lack of, I mean, if you want to use their word, Holocaust of elephants and rhinos. And the same in South Africa. Under apartheid, that wasn't happening. But after apartheid ended, so again, it ends up becoming this sort of like oikophobia, hatred of white people, even though the only people that were protecting rhinos and elephants were white people. And when, you went to black majority rule, it was open season and these animals got trashed. And it's like, okay, so the communists, the black nationalists just have no ecological principles. And you're gonna defend them or be silent. That to me is just a smoking gun.
Yeah, and we should also not forget. I mean, I'm now starting to doubt the stories. Like, not right now, but I've done that for past 2 or 3 years. All the story is always about the evil white man came into the United States and he destroyed all the Native Americans and so who lived in harmony with nature, and they kept the buffalo alive, but then the evil white man came and destroyed all the buffalo. I don't think that's true, because I remember seeing some reports where they absolutely did butcher their own buffalo hordes. But these Indian tribes, they were never really, these native tribes, they were never really that big, so that they could really really have a strong impact on buffalo. Maybe that was the saving grace there, but they did completely trash those buffalo hordes. That's what I remember, right? But then the left always has this romanticizing of the noble savage, right? They would not do that. They are the good people, and we in the white, we are the bad people. There's a lot of masochism in there, and if they want to inflict like self-hate, that plays a role. Also, when I grew up in West Germany, and we always knew in the GDR, when it still existed in the 1980s, there was several cities like Bitterfeld, is a bitter field in English. It got the name I mean, the name was fitting because there was a big brown coal industry there. Now that brown coal is a pretty dirty way to generate electricity. But what also happened in these cities where you have these industries, everything was brown and gray in these cities. The houses looked horrible. And if you saw pictures from Bitterfeld, you would not think anyone would really enjoy living there, right? But that was always kind of like noticed. But the left, never, in the Green Party, never really attacked the GDR for that. It's like, oh yeah, that's bad there. But here, look, Britain, industrialization. By the way, the story about the moth. There's an evolution example that you had like a lot of white moths, I think, and then before industrialization, and you have industrialization, and all of a sudden now you get darker moths because they could hide better, in like a blackish soot-like environment, right? While that may be true, it's also the case that that also put the entire focus on Britain. You know, the subtext of that is that Britain did so much, that Britain industrialized so much that even the local animal population changed because of it, right? That was another narrative device that puts the blame on the West and lets Russia scoot off completely scot free.
Well,
Um, and
yeah,
also, by the way, Chernobyl was in Russia, of course, right? That also got never addressed. It was like, no, let's make safe nuclear power plants. No, it was like here, Russia, here Chernobyl. That's a dangerous power plant. It's not that Russia had a problem, that Russia didn't set up the power plant that properly, that Russia didn't have security enough around the power plant, and that communist regimes are notoriously bad in keeping catastrophes under control. No, no, no. It was like an indictment of the entire nuclear power industry.
so the other thing, two other examples here. Well, three. So the Aral Sea is almost entirely dried up. That was due to the botched Soviet program under Khrushchev to cultivate cotton in Kazakhstan, redirecting water resources there. We also have the idea that Stone Age peoples can and do hunt animals to extinction. So, for example, when Clovis man entered North America, he hunted to extinction the megafauna like the mammoths and the mastodons. And then when the Maori settled in New Zealand in around the year 1000 AD, they hunted the moa bird to extinction, which then also killed Haas eagle, which fed on the moa. So again, that's not to say that the hunting of the buffalo by Americans was a good thing, but Clovis man did just as much damage when he came in and hunted the mammoths down. And we see Iceland or New Zealand with the moa. And so it's not that simple, right? And furthermore, Madagascar used to be where another giant flightless bird, the elephant bird, lived, and now it's extinct. So I would strongly suspect that when Africans settled that island, they probably hunted it to extinction. So again, it's a broader problem that needs to be contextualized, and so by ignoring the communists, the Africans, the Chinese, communists, and the Clovis man, and the Polynesians, who can just as well do tremendous ecological damage. This just trivializes the problem. Any group of humans with the wrong set of incentives can do tremendous damage to the environment. You need to learn from those lessons and not repeat them again. But the environmental movement wasn't interested in that. They were interested in scapegoating white Europeans, the ones who actually invented modern conservation, go figure, right? Like Teddy Roosevelt, and defending countries that had abysmal environmental records. Abysmal. Like communist countries, like the African countries. So yeah, this is just not a serious movement. Now, the very, very beginnings of the environmental movement, like you said in Germany in the 19th century or the United States, serious. I mean, they were dealing with serious problems. And national parks were a good idea. I think Theodore Roosevelt was correct on that. But again, this was not a part of a broader anti-human narrative, because ultimately it's an anti-human narrative because of the population reduction, the abortion, that whole angle that the environmentalists brought to the table. Right? It's not just common sense ecology and not destroying the ecosystem that you live in. It's deeply anti-human, often expressed in terms of anti-white, but it's ultimately anti-human because they don't want anybody really alive to, spoil pristine Mother Nature. So, and again, I think what happens is the sensible policies like we had with like Teddy Roosevelt were just kind of like sidelined, or like, cleaning up the Clean Air Act, right? You don't want to be choking on smog in LA. Sensible policies, right? This is not saying that we're going to like depopulate the world or something.
Yeah, and exactly that is. It's good that you say that because that's exactly what I hear from even from normies, right? So they will say, well, I don't agree with environmentalism in general, but cleaning up the cities from smog, that was a good thing to do. He probably also likes going to national parks, and I think maybe there's some kind of, but because it's the same people, they like national parks. I think it's good to not live in smog, and they also are disgusted by political correctness, DEI, and that stuff. So the DEI stuff, political correctness stuff, the left wing narratives that have taken over all the environmentalism and putting out this climate change hoax. These people, they annoy other people, but you can still gain people for environmentalist initiatives, right? And not littering, for example. I'm just horrified when I see a street in India, and I'm sure there are nice areas in India. I don't want to like everything in India is bad, but you see a main street, there's like trash everywhere. Cows are grazing between the trash. Aren't the cows like holy to you? You let them eat trash? If that doesn't make sense. But it's like nobody cares. And that is like, and you live in a sewage base. There's open sewage everywhere. And that is just something I find it unbelievable. But some people, they don't care, and they are fine living in that. And so that's how I lost my train of thought. What was I saying before?
I don't remember.
but yeah. So okay, if you want to put in if you want to go back to environmentalism, I think it's important to notice that people are actually open for treating the environment nicely, especially in the U.S., in the Western world. That's something they like. Also, I can't imagine that they like dirt and trash laying around in some areas in Paris, for example. So that's something you can get a public consensus with, right? And maybe that's one way, also one way to just throw all the DEI part and all the PsyOp part to the wayside.
Yeah. But I think we've covered the basic theme here. So I'll just briefly recap. The modern environmental movement, by modern I mean like the last 40 years, I believe it is a PsyOp in order to do 6 things: suppress the world economic development, or developing countries, run cover for free trade gutting the U.S., pushing depopulation narratives, discrediting sensible environmental policies with junk science, creating fear through megalophobia, and pushing for one world government. They broadly got 5 out of 6. And then also the environmental movement as such has broadly just been anti-human and anti-white, defending countries with atrocious environmental track records, communist countries, African countries, and then Stone Age peoples like Clovis Man and the Maori. So it's it trivializes the problem and then makes it so you can't deal with it, because if you ignore all those other cases and just focus on selectively focus on certain white Europeans or Americans doing this, you're creating an environment in which it's not really possible to come to some sort of consensus on environmental policy.
I agree.
All right. Well, thank you, Flurian. It's always a pleasure having you on.
Thank you for having me.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fight podcast, signing off.